5 seconds. All right, let's go ahead and pray. Lord, again, we thank you for uniting us to Christ. We thank you for his death. We thank you for the cross. And we thank you for your faithfulness to your church throughout all of time and all of history. And we ask that you would continue to encourage us and strengthen us for our service to you. As long as you would leave us here on this earth, that as we consider church history, this would be not just an intellectual exercise, but this would be of use in building us up, so that we might be faithful in the context you have placed us in. We ask this all in Jesus' name and for his glory. Amen. All right. We are nearing the end of our survey of church history. So if you're just joining us or if you haven't been with us in a while, we've been doing a flyby coverage of church history. The last 2 weeks, we were thinking about the evangelical revival and the Great Awakening in Europe and America. And now we're going to turn our attention back to Roman Catholicism, because it's been a while since we've talked about the Catholics. Does anyone remember last we peeked in on the Catholics? What were they up to? I remember the last kind of stuff we talked about. The Jansenists, right? Yeah, the time when they almost became, all the Catholics almost became Calvinists. Not quite, but kind of close. So last we looked, we were back with them in Reformation, post-Reformation time period. We saw the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent, and how the Roman Catholicism officially responded to the Protestant reformers. And then we saw the immediate aftermath with the conflict between the Jansenists and the Jesuits. You remember, the Jesuits won that conflict. Although, interestingly enough, shortly thereafter, the Jesuits were disbanded, or they were suppressed, officially suppressed by the Pope. They had enough dislike in the various areas that they were, that the Pope got enough pressure from various governments. We don't want the Jesuits in our countries. We don't like them. We're suspicious of them. They're too loyal to you. They're an independent power we don't want running around. And so the Jesuits actually were suppressed in the late 1700s, mid-1700s, and that lasted for quite some time before a later Pope eventually granted them order status again. Because if you're thinking, wait, we still have Jesuits. Yes, they were restored, but shortly after beating the Jansenists, they were completely suppressed for other reasons. But we're going to now make quite a significant jump. But there's a reason for that. When you think about the evangelical revival and the Great Awakening in English Protestantism, now this can be pressed too far, but in many ways, that brings us to today. In many ways, that brings us, especially at a church like ours, Reformed Baptist Church, that brings us to today where, and what I mean by that is, if you transplanted Augustine to the Reformation time period, there would be lots of terminology and lots of doctrinal conversations and things that he'd say, well, I don't know what's going on here. There would be a lot for Augustine to learn, to catch up. If you transported Calvin to the Great Awakening time period, and obviously it's a much smaller time period, so it makes sense. If you transported Calvin to the Great Awakening time period, there'd be significantly less, maybe a little bit, but significantly less where Calvin would be like, I don't really recognize this. And then even less so, you grab a Whitefield and Edwards, you bring them to our church today, I think for the most part, they would recognize it. So in many ways, yes, there have been things that happened since, but theologically, in terms of the theological controversies, the ways we've solidified doctrine, language, yes, there have been other things, rise of liberal biblical criticism, the worship wars, things like that, but in a very real sense, Edwards and Whitefield would feel very at home today. This is not so over on the Catholic side. If you grab a Catholic from the 1800s, it's going to look Roman Catholicism today is going to look very, very different than a Roman Catholic Church in the 1800s. And that's because Rome was defined largely by Trent. In fact, we call it Tridentine Catholicism. So for a long time, Rome is defined by Trent. And you'll remember that a lot of the things we think of when we think of Roman Catholicism, a lot of things that we think of, that doesn't go back much further than Trent in terms of official status. Yeah, their beliefs have gone back further, things about the supremacy of the Pope or the nature of justification. It's not that the Roman Catholic positions were made up whole cloth, but a lot of what we think about as official Catholic doctrine wasn't solidified till Trent. So for instance, their position on the Apocrypha, that wasn't solidified till Trent. So Trent paved the way forward for some time. But today, it's not that you won't find any Tridentine churches, today, Roman Catholicism, by and large, is not defined by Trent, at least in the majority sense. It is far more influenced by the Second Vatican Council. So we're going to think about both of them. Very briefly. We'll spend most of our time on Vatican II because that's the larger one, that's the more important one. We're going to look at the next two councils, which was Vatican I and Vatican II. So those are the next two councils after Trent. So you remember Trent in the 1500s, and then the next council we get is in 1869. So 1869, we get Vatican I. Vatican I, called by Pope Pius IX. Called by Pope Pius IX, Vatican I was intended to respond to modernism, liberalism. You're starting to get more atheism, more deism. So this is in the mid 1800s. So we're even moving past where we were in the Protestant world last week. You remember the rise of deism, the Enlightenment, rationalism. I mean, Vatican I was concerned with rationalism, communism, deism, atheism. So we've got all these modernistic movements, and Vatican I wanted to respond to this. Pope Pius IX wants to respond to this, so he calls Vatican I. This is church council, and about 700 bishops attended, and it didn't actually last that long. Really, two things got done. They produced two documents. I didn't put any of the to read. So here's why. All of the to reads today are in Latin. And I will not spell them, and I would not say them correctly. They're all in Latin. But if you just look up Vatican I documents, Vatican II documents, those are all online. You can read them. If you want to get an understanding, you can read them. And they're not too hard. The English translations, they're fairly straightforward. But their titles are all in Latin. So Vatican I produces two documents. One is its kind of broad brush response to modernism, condemning atheism, rationalism, communism, enshrining the theology of Thomas Aquinas in particular, saying this is the gold standard. This is the gold standard for Roman Catholic theology. It's Thomas Aquinas. So that's what Vatican I on the one hand did, where we deny modernism, we reject atheism, we reject liberal biblical criticism, we reject rationalism, and other movements, communism, and we enshrine Thomas Aquinas as the paragon, the best example of Roman Catholic theology and thinking and philosophy. The other thing Vatican I did was formally define as doctrine papal infallibility. So you see that even this is not an official dogma, like on the books of the church, until 1870. So 1870, Vatican I, so we've got our response to modernism, and papal infallibility. It's not till 1870, this is 1869, 1870, it didn't last long. It's not till 1870 that papal infallibility is on the books in Roman Catholicism as an official doctrine. It's not that no one believed it till then. It's not that they made it up in Vatican I. But this is when we're going to formally define what does it mean that the Pope is infallible, and we're going to make it an official doctrine of the church. There was a significant opposition to defining papal infallibility at this point, not because there was a significant portion of the church that didn't believe in it. In the Roman Catholic world, most of the bishops there, at least represented, believed in papal infallibility. But a lot of them thought it wasn't prudent at this time to create a document and to make this an official dogma on paper. The reason being, they were more concerned with papal authorities. We want to shore up the Pope's authority in the world. And if we make this document, if we make this proclamation, it's going to give us more enemies outside the church. That, it's going to make it harder for us to have dialogue with Protestants. It's going to make governments unhappy with us. So there was a significant portion who argued against defining papal infallibility at this point, though when they actually came to a vote, almost all people voted for it, because doctrinally they all agreed. Doctrinally they agreed in the concept of papal infallibility. Again, the concept wasn't new. As we saw, it was there in Reformation times, arguments assuming a sort of ultimate authority of the Pope and that he has a measure of infallibility extending specifically to the realm of doctrine. So you've probably heard the phrase, the Pope is infallible when? He's not infallible all the time. When is the Pope infallible? Ex cathedra. And so in Roman Catholic theology, that's when the Pope is infallible. When he's speaking ex cathedra, when he's speaking from the seat, meaning not when he's literally sitting down, but when he's speaking in his office relative to defining doctrine and morals of the church, he is proclaimed to be infallible in Roman Catholic theology. So just like we saw in the Jansenist debates, he's not infallible regarding fact, right? He can get history wrong, he can get all sorts of things wrong, but when he's defining a doctrine for the church, the Roman Catholics in Vatican I, again, they believed it before. They said, all right, the Pope is infallible in these areas in this time. Even then, the wording is a little looser. He has the infallibility which the Lord so willed for his church to have, which is it's interesting that they qualify it. Like, it doesn't just say his infallibility. It's like the infallibility, the type of infallibility that the Lord desired for him to have, which theoretically leaves open room for, it doesn't have to be necessarily that infallible because maybe the Lord didn't intend him to have that much infallibility. So even the wording leaves a little open room for debate. But this is what Vatican II does. It doesn't get much done. There's only these two things, and this is because the France-Prussian War broke out, and at the time, the Pope and the Vatican was having trouble from Italy. We were in Italy, but the Italian troops are opposed to the Vatican and the Pope, and it was actually French troops that was protecting the Vatican City. And then the France-Prussian War breaks out, so all the French troops have to leave and go fight in the war, and so now the Pope has no one protecting him from the Italian troops, so he doesn't have time to be dealing with councils. He's got war and politics to deal with, so the council gets put on hold. They pause it, and it's paused for 90 years officially. So for 90 years officially, it wasn't until 1960 that one of the popes goes, all right, that's done. We're never getting back to that. So 1960 is when it's formally adjourned, but 1870 is when the last thing they did. Questions about Vatican I? This is good. It's good to not have questions because Vatican II tosses this aside. Not really, not literally, but in many ways, people understand Vatican II to be a rejection of Vatican I, or certainly moving in the opposite direction. So we've got Vatican II. This is the big one. This is the one that defines Catholicism today. If you go to most, not all, but if you randomly were to pick a Roman Catholic church and you go inside, what you experience is going to be probably influenced or a direct result of Vatican II. So Vatican II, this is from 1962 to 1965. It met for 4 years. And I believe, you guys can fact check me on this, I believe that this is the largest deliberative body to have ever met in history. I mean, it's the largest gathering where like sports arenas are filled with way more people than Vatican II, but it's the largest gathering where the people gathered all have to participate. Like technically China's Congress, or whatever they call it, has more people, but that's a shame. but where you actually have people who have to show up and participate and cast votes. This is the largest body that has, I think, ever existed that we know of in the history of the planet. So this is Vatican II. Pope John 23, within months of being elected in 1958, 1959, within months of being elected, he says, I want to call a church council. And this was a surprise. No one had been, like there hadn't been rumblings to, anyone's knowledge. This hadn't been something that the church had been, angling for. There wasn't a council party in the church saying, oh man, we got to get another council going. But he gets elected, and within months, he says, we're going to call a church council. We're going to call a church council. He says the church needs, and again, there was an Italian word, aggiornamento. The church needs updating. The church needs updating. And what he meant by that is we are in a new context that we have kind of been ignoring. We need to respond to the context that we're in. We need to respond to the modern world. We need to respond to current culture. So the church needs updating. He's reported to have said, no one knows 100%, he's reported to have said, oh, why do you want to have a council? And he's like, we need to open the windows of the church and let some fresh air in. It's getting dusty in here. And so Pope John 23 calls Vatican I. This is, so if you want to understand like the process for how the council works or how something like this happens, I mean, it takes years, right? Because first of all the bishops are invited. All the bishops are invited. At this time, that's about 2,900. 2,900 bishops are invited, and a great majority of them are able to attend. Around 2,400, 2,500 are able to attend. About 500 are unable to attend either for health or age or because they happen to live in a country that won't allow for travel. So, but around 2,400, 2,500 bishops do end up attending. So one, it's a giant logistical, we're organizing this invitation, we got to get people coming. Two, like how do you decide what you're going to talk about and in what way you're going to talk about? That's a lot of people. I mean, some people feel like, wow, my local church's members meetings go for a long time. You get 2,500 people together in a room, that's going to be a long meeting. And sure enough, it met over 4 years in various sessions. And so the way it was organized is Pope John 23, he asks for, first of all, topics. What should we talk about? So he reaches out. He reaches out to all bishops, so those 2,900 people were invited. He reaches out to the Catholic universities and the theological faculty at those Catholic universities, and he reaches out to all the people in the Curia. Does anyone know what that is, the Curia? It's this analogy, someone might quibble with it, but it's like the White House. So the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church, and he's in Vatican City, and Vatican City is his own self-governed entity. And, well, how is Vatican City run, and how does the church actually run? How does the Pope actually run the worldwide church? The Curia is the equivalent of the White House staff and the cabinet for the president. And these are the people who are actually administering and doing all the specifics, and the Pope is overseeing them. So you've got the Curia, you've got the theological colleges and faculty, and you've got the bishops. And so the Pope polls them all, or he kind of gives an open invitation. What should we talk about? And he gets, they called them something in Latin, the wishes. He gets 9,438 responses, 9,438 wishes. Like these are things we want to talk about or want to have happen at this council. We want this to be defined, or we want this to be condemned, or we want this practice to be instituted, or we want this practice to be abolished. So 9,438 wishes that the Pope receives. Now what do you do with that? He established commissions. There were 10 commissions, and these commissions were also basically the 10 offices of the Curia, and the person who was in head of those offices in the Curia was in head of the commission. And so you had 10 commissions, and the various wishes were kind of divided up by topic. Like, okay, this is theology, this is how we relate to Eastern Catholic churches, this is missions, so on and so forth. So you had these 10 commissions that each had an area of specialty, area of expertise, and they divided all the wishes and handed them to them and said, all right, you guys are to take this, you're to digest it, and you guys are going to prepare what they called schemas, which these are drafts. These are draft proposals of how we are going to respond, what we're going to talk about, or what we're going to decide at the council. And so you had these 10 commissions. They would look at all the stuff, and they would produce. Some of them just kind of subsumed it all under one, and they produced just one schema. Some of them produced like as many as 70, or maybe not that high. I think 70 was the grand total, but as many 20, 30 schemas. Like we've got a schema for this, we've got a schema. So these are documents. We've got a document for this, document for this, document for this. And so they prepared these drafts, and what these were the proclamations. These were the decisions, but just the drafts, the initial form. And so then, when all that preparatory work takes 2-3 years. Then, and that's before this. 1962 is when they first get together. So everyone comes together, 2,500 bishops. So who's there? You have the council fathers. Those are the bishops. Those are the voting members. So all the bishops come. All the bishops get to vote. 2,500 bishops. The council fathers, they get to vote. You also have the pareti, the advisors. The Pope invites a number of experts, theological experts. So it's the same today. Many of the most educated Roman Catholics in terms of being in the universities and being theological scholars aren't themselves priests or bishops. They're just lay people who are educated and then teaching in the faculties. Just like even on the Protestant side, lots of professors at seminaries aren't pastors. And so the Pope invites a number of experts. So they're not allowed to talk, but they're not allowed to vote, they're not allowed to be part of the debate, but they will be consulted variously throughout. So like when they're asked a question, they're allowed to talk, but they're not allowed to otherwise engage in the debate. And then each council father was allowed to bring his own personal expert. Like you were allowed to bring your own, I think your own personal expert, who again, I don't know if they were allowed on the floor, but they were able to come with you so that you can confer with them about whatever you wanted. And then the Pope also invited outside observers. He invited people from the Protestant world. He invited people from the Eastern Orthodox world. And a large number showed up. And certain parts of the proceedings were open to the public, were open to the news and the media. They had their general congregations, their main sessions weren't, but every once in a while they had a public open session that was available to the media. Otherwise, what happened in the private sessions was supposed to be secret, but 2,500 people in the age of TV, so none of it was secret. Everyone knew what they were talking about, what they were saying and deciding. And so you've got all these people gathered, you've got your observers, you've got your experts, and you've got your pre-planned documents that you're going to be discussing. All right, we've got our proposals. And so this is what they would do over the 4 years in each session. Each session would be like, well, we're covering this proposal and this proposal. And they would read the proposal, and then it would just be open for debate. I think that's wrong. I think that's right. Or how should we fix this? And so on and so forth. And, well, actually, let me back up. How do you handle that, right? Like, okay, what's the odds that this pre-made proposal is going to be accepted? And none of them were accepted. But, I mean, they knew that. They knew, like, this is just a draft. So then how do you actually go about revising it? Well, you need another commission. You need specific commissions. So you had the 10 who drafted them, and then the Pope proposed basically those same people to be the ones who would revise it. And then the first day of Vatican councils, one of the bishops said, no, we should vote on, because they were voting on. He said, but we should be given more time to propose our own people to go on these commissions, because most of the bishops didn't know anyone outside of their own country, right? So how do we know who to vote on? And so it was a more pragmatic thing. The Pope's like, I'll suggest people, and they said, well, maybe give us some time to propose our own people. Say like, I got this guy in my country, and he's really good at this, and so on and so forth. And so everyone liked that idea. So they took some time to draw up lists and present them to each other, and then they built these commissions. So each commission, again, 10 commissions for the various topics, theology, missions, so on and so forth, media, modern world. And they had 25 people on each commission. 16 were voted on by the people, so by the bishops. 16 were chosen by the bishops, and then 9 were appointed by the Pope. By the Pope. So you got 25 people total on each commission. So once they settled that, once we know who's on the commission, Then you'd have your schema. This would be presented, and it would be discussed and debated. And then obviously the people on the commission are all in the room because they're all church fathers too, the council fathers too. They're all bishops too. And then it's their job to then go back in the evening or whatever and start revising in light of the discussion, in light of the debate. And then they bring it back, and then you debate it again the next day or whenever. You had multiple things that you had to do on the docket. And so you would just go through that cycle until it seemed like we were reaching a consensus where this will be approved. They required a two-thirds majority vote to approve any particular schema, any particular document. Two-thirds majority. But they had a kind of, that was like the official rules of order. This has to be a two-thirds majority. However, there was a kind of an unofficial sentiment where, like, if something is going to become official dogma of the church, it should have 90%. It should have 90% at least acquiescence from everybody. And the way they did this, and it generally worked, was once we got to a point where we were happy with this document and we were going to vote on it, we voted on it. As long as it got the two-thirds, we would be happy with that, and then there would be a second vote. And usually in the second vote, most of the dissenters were like, okay, well, this is the will of everyone else, and then they would fall in line. And so you would get a much higher positive vote after the first. So the second one was more ceremonial. It was, we've done the first vote, everyone seems to be happy, all right, let's draft up the official version with the stamp and everything and make it all nice, and then we'll have another final ceremonial vote, and in that second one, you usually had basically everyone agreeing. You literally dropped from 60 opposed to 2 opposed. And so that was the procedures. This is what we did. And not what we did, what the Roman Catholics did. And they produced 16 major documents. These are relatively long and varying. So you're welcome to read them. They're long. Again, not too hard. All their titles are in Latin. They produced 4 what they call constitutions, 9 declarations, and 3 decrees. I do not know what the difference between a declaration and a decree is. I read one author who said, if there was a difference, I'm not sure that even they knew. But these are technical distinctions. So 4 constitutions, the largest and most important documents, 9 declarations, and 3 decrees. And what Vatican II did overall in its tenor was, in many people's eyes, move in the absolute opposite direction of Vatican I in its response to modernism. It said, no, we're going to embrace things that the Catholic Church has historically been very averse to embracing. So there's no way I can cover everything that Vatican II decided and affirmed, but even we'll just give you some highlights. Again, that will show you this is kind of what is defining Roman Catholicism today. Even in the way it was presented, Pope John XXIII, who actually died in the middle. He died in 1963, and so he was succeeded by Pope Paul VI. And Paul and John, John is the one who wanted this. The way that the documents were formulated was not in terms of pronouncements and condemnations, the way like Trent was, where we anathematize this, we say this, we pronounce this, and we curse this. It was not done in that format. In fact, to such a degree that some people wondered at the end, is any of this binding? Because we don't say you have to believe this and you're cursed if you don't. And Pope said, no, it's binding. We want a softer touch. We want a softer touch in how we are presenting these things. So even then you can hear a kind of oh, that's different. It's different. We want a softer hand. Among the things that were decided in Vatican II was a strong position on religious freedom, meaning it is now the official position of the Catholic Church that religious freedom is a human right. That is a human right. So some of us, we live in our American context, we're like, oh, didn't everyone always think this? No, and this is maybe one of the most controversial. This is one of the most controversial within the Catholic Church. In fact, to this day, you have traditionalist Catholics who, to some degree, are very unhappy with Vatican II, to varying degrees. So you have many traditionalist Catholics who, if you visit their church, this is why I said not 100%. If you go into a random Catholic church, for the most part, it's going to be defined by Vatican II, but you might have happened into a traditionalist Catholic church. There are some that basically ignore Vatican II. We do everything the way we did before, and we basically ignore Vatican II. But we're still in the Catholic Church. You have others, more extreme, in the traditionalist camp, who are, if you've ever heard this term, sedevacantists. Who knows what that is? What is a sedevacantist? It is a Roman Catholic. It means empty seat in Latin. It is a Roman Catholic who believes there is no current valid pope. That Pope Pius XI, the one pope right before John 23, he was the last valid pope, and then John 23 couldn't have been a valid pope because he called Vatican II and they did that, and that's all heresy. So it's not possible. It's not possible. So they're Roman Catholics, so they have Catholic convictions about the shape of the church, the organization of the church, that there is a pope, and the pope is the head of the church. So they have these Catholic convictions, but what happened at Vatican II is so discongruous with what they believed the church teach before that says that can't possibly be, that can't be the pope. That can't be, there's either no pope. Some of them elected their own competing popes, sometimes as small as 6. Like there's this one pope, Pope Michael I. It was like him, his parents, and 3 other people elected him the new pope. So he was new pope. So there's one group competing. So none of them elected their own popes, but most sedevacantists didn't elect their own pope. So they don't have a competing pope. They just say, we just don't have a pope right now, and we haven't for the last 60 years. Don, question. No, nope. But no, it's the same issue, but so that's traditionalist, and so I'll get to that in a second. But that's the traditionalist by and large. But I'll explain the Latin Mass in a second. But yeah, that was one of the ones. Religious freedom was maybe the most contentious. There are a few that were all kind of tied for most contentious. Religious freedom, and here's why. So the Catholic Church defined it as a basic human right. It is a basic human right that people should be allowed to believe what they want to believe. They should not be constrained by the law. There should be no external constraints. Now, Roman Catholicism has always said, you can't force belief, for the most part. There may be the actions sometimes look different. But on paper, the idea was you can't force belief. But the official position of the Roman Catholic Church up till Vatican II was only Catholicism is true. No other beliefs have any right to exist, so they deserve no legal protection. Now, Roman Catholicism didn't always fight to abolish other religions where they lived, but their theological rationale for that was sometimes it's prudent, politically, socially, to coexist with other belief systems. That's fine. It's fine to be prudent or pragmatic about this. But what is not fine is to have any sort of sense that these other religions have a right to exist. And so Roman Catholicism, up to that point, said, no, there is no human right for religious freedom. And Vatican II said there is, and a number of Catholics said, if you're saying this, then you're saying we've been wrong. You're saying, this too fundamentally contradicts stated official positions of the church for the last 1900 years. This too strongly contradicts what we've done for too long. So this is one of the reasons why. This is one of the big ones. Religious freedom, hugely controversial. Another one that was hugely controversial was the Latin Mass. Up to this point, Mass happened in Latin. And you know how many people spoke Latin at this time? Huh? Did someone say 4? Oh, yeah, 4. That's about right. Good guess. Yeah. Only the priests, even sometimes not them, but they knew what to say. They knew how to recite this. And so you had Latin Mass, and you can imagine already, because even in the modern age, people come to church and they don't take it seriously, and they're on their phones or they're sleeping and you're not paying attention. So imagine how much more you are not paying attention if you don't understand what is being said. So it's an issue. For the most part, people came and did private devotions. So it was kind of like you had this show up on the stage that to varying degrees you understood what it meant and what was happening, but people would come to Mass and do their own thing. In fact, there were tables set alongside the churches and things, and you would go and you would do your prayers and you would read the Bible. So you would just do your own thing while Mass was happening. And Vatican II said, this is not good. We want to involve the people. People need to be actively engaged. And this needs to be a corporate experience. Like, people can read their Bible at home. People can pray at home. We want them to be doing individual devotions, but for when people come together, it should be a corporate thing. And so, Vatican II did not abolish the Latin Mass. Sometimes that's a misconception. Vatican II did not abolish the Latin Mass. What it did was it said you are allowed to do non-Latin Mass. And Latin Mass disappeared basically overnight. So they said, you're allowed to do non-Latin Mass. Like, the official document says, like, we affirm the Latin Mass, we affirm this is like, you should keep this, you should do it, but it may be prudent in some situations to do non-Latin, and that's okay. And that basically made it disappear overnight. Latin Mass is, again, you can still find traditionalist Catholic Church who are like, no way, we're sticking with the exact form. And other things changed too. Vestments, decorations, the way churches were designed, the organization of the furniture, lots of stuff changed. So if you go to a traditionalist Catholic Church, you will still see all of the pre-Vatican II Catholicism. And some churches still do a Latin Mass. Everything else having been changed, they still do a Latin Mass, but they'll also do a Mass in the vernacular, in the language of the people, and that's the one people basically attend. And so you had the Latin Mass being not removed, but allowed they allowed for Mass to happen in normal language, and that's what everyone chose to do. You had the relationship to other Christians. Again, I'm just covering the most controversial in-house from the Roman Catholic perspective. Relationship to other Christians. So, it is in Vatican II, if you've ever heard this term, that Protestants are now identified as separated brethren. We are no longer, in their eyes, heretics or condemned and going to hell. It is Vatican II that said, no, these are separated brethren. Vatican II had this language about the church, which many people objected to, which said the church subsists in the Roman Catholic Church. Subsistent. Prior to this, they would have said is. And in fact, the first draft of the document did say is. The church is the Roman Catholic Church. Now they say the church subsisted, meaning it is primarily there, but it is elsewhere too. If you remember when we talked about the different views of church and state and church government, when we were looking at the Reformation, one of the big differences between Rome and the Protestants, one of the big differences between Rome and all the other Protestants was all of the Protestants understood the church to be the invisible people of God. That's what the church is. It is the true invisible, all believers everywhere, regardless of where they happen to be. That's what the church is. It's an invisible reality, which of course has a visible manifestation, it has a local organization, but it is fundamentally an invisible reality. Whereas the Roman Catholic position was, no, the church is the visible institution. That's why we saw, even though we would disagree vehemently, you could understand, if that's your belief, how the logic works out, where you can have a pope who's corrupt, because it's what's most important is institutional continuity. Not like, obviously they wouldn't be happy with that. We got to get rid of the corrupt pope, but he's still a legitimate pope because what matters is institutional continuity. If you have a company and you've got a bad CEO, he's just a bad CEO. He's no longer the CEO. So for them, in Roman Catholicism, up to this point, Roman Catholic theology defined the church as Roman Catholicism. That is the church. It's the institution, the organization. And Vatican II, they moved towards a more, in one sense, Protestant understanding, where they recognize, no, we are the main thing, but you can be saved and be outside. And so the way they talk about this is we've got separated brethren, and there's degrees. Roman Catholicism said the Eastern churches are much closer, And, various Protestants can get further and further away, but wherever you find Christ, and you can find him in these churches, Vatican II said, that there is salvation. And so they're separated brethren. It's not ideal. They should come back. They should be in full communion with Rome, but they're real Christians. So Vatican II made that pronouncement. And again, that is the way you meet the average Catholic today. That is their position. In fact, you meet the average layperson just in many religions. You're going to meet a nominal person. But if you meet the average Catholic, they're not going to, often now to their ears, you ask them the differences, it's just a difference in taste, like worship taste. You meet the average Catholic on the street, so what's the difference between a Roman Catholic and a Baptist? And they might not be able to tell you theologically what the difference is. It might just be in their mind purely an aesthetic choice of like, oh yeah, our church, it's just decoration. Like that's it. Such is the degree that even in official Catholic theology, an emphasis has been on a more kind of universal brotherhood. And again, not all the Catholics were happy with this. You have your traditionalists, and to the extreme, your sedevacantist. So you have your relationship to the Christians and your relationships to other religions. Now, Vatican II did not say you could be saved by being part of other religions. They drew a firm line there. However, Vatican II very consciously wanted to focus on the positives. That was kind of the language. Like, let's focus on what we have in common with the other religions. Let's appreciate the good things in them. Let's not, deny the good things in other religions. So Vatican II says that's what we want to do as a Catholic Church. We want to focus on the good in other religions. We're not saying you could be saved. We're not saying you could be saved outside of Christ. But let's foster more brotherhood. Let's work together more. Let's partner together more where we are able to, where we agree. Let's be able to have these coalitions. And so these four tend to be the biggest things that upset traditionalist Catholics, to the point that some said this is either moving in the wrong direction, we're fully accepting modernism now, and to the point that you have some who said this can't be. It contradicts too much that has gone before. And the actual process was quite interesting. All of these obviously passed. These were what Vatican II adopted. But going in, you had the people very clearly, as often is the case, very clearly from the beginning, you had, okay, we've kind of got two parties in this Vatican II Council. We have those who are really for some sort of updating. We have what was at the time called the new Catholic New Theologians, who tended to be more liberal socially, theologically, but also in some ways more conservative in that they wanted to return to reading the sources, reading the Church Fathers. Their logic was, we have been operating as if society is Christian, but it's not anymore. We all have to recognize that and reckon with that. The Church Fathers lived in a society that wasn't Christian. Let's go back to them and see what they said. Maybe they've got some ideas. And so you had this whole new theology, it was called New Theology movement in Roman Catholicism. That was basically condemned officially, but very shortly after, Pope John XXIII comes, he calls a council, and all the new theologians who were formerly disgraced were invited. And suddenly it's like, oh, we thought we were done, and now there's discussion happening. And so you had your two parties, your conservatives, your liberals, and it seemed like conservatives would win the day, but the ones who were pushing for where Vatican II eventually ended up, they were either persuasive or they got on the right commissions, and overall, even the most contentious, I believe religious freedom was the most contentious, had like 250 vote against. So it's like 2,200 for, 250 against. So for the most part, though, all the 16 documents of Vatican II were obviously they're affirmed because they are the 16 documents of Vatican II. And so now, if you go to a Roman Catholic church, by and large, you are probably experiencing Vatican II Catholicism. That's just where we are today. All right. Questions, thoughts about that? Anything burning that I didn't cover? There's a lot. All right. Let's close in prayer. Lord, again, we thank you for your faithfulness to us. And even as we look outside our church walls and we consider Rome, and we recognize that we are self-consciously Protestant, that we reject the way Rome has defined and diluted the gospel. We ask that you would continue to help us to understand what's going on in Roman Catholicism, that we might speak fruitfully with Roman Catholics, that we might evangelize faithfully, that we might be bold, confident in proclaiming the gospel, and proclaiming the truth, and that people might believe, that they would turn from trusting in themselves, that they would acknowledge the only hope for justification is faith in Christ and his righteousness counted to them. So we do pray that you would help us to be more faithful and more exacting in our evangelism, in our relating to Roman Catholics, our neighbors, our friends, our family members. Grant us as a church to continually be more and more faithful to our call to witness and represent you. We pray this all in Jesus' name and for his glory. Amen.